Kia ora, Nicky.
Kia ora, Graham.
How are you today?
Oh, ke te pihi a koe. I'm good.
I'm very pleased to hear that. Thank you. Good to know. So you and I are catching up because we're just going to talk a little bit about the fact that we know that our students are going on. So all of our students going on all placements are going to be looking to achieve mental health related learning objectives. And one of the things that I know that you and I are keen to emphasize for our students is the importance of thinking about developing those mental health skills alongside and integrating those developing skills with their cultural competence and their skills in working alongside Māori, Pacifica people and people from other cultures. So that's why we're getting together.
That's right, we are.
And I know that this morning we were in another meeting together, so it's the second time today you're putting up with me. We were in a meeting together earlier where we were talking about practical ways to integrate those two things, mental health specific skills and thinking about how you're working alongside people in a way that is culturally safe and appropriate. And I thought a really good example that came from meeting was one that we could just kind of pick up on now, really. So we were talking about mental state assessment, and can you remember the question that you asked of me in that meeting?
I asked a number of questions about at that meeting, Graham.
All right.
So was it the one around Potomi?
Yes.
Okay.
That one.
So the question that I asked was, I guess I asked a couple actually. So I'll say the question that I think it was, and then
Yep.
you can. Yep. So I think it was the question around when you're using a framework like Potomi in a cultural way, so with someone who is Māori or Pacific, and you're using whanaunga as your, I guess, way of building that safe space and way of building trust and rapport,
Yep.
how you could then blend those two together. Like, were the students needing to actually bring Potomi out as a structured type of framework, or are they still able to use whanaunga as their way of making those connections and also observations, and then being able to put them or thread them into the Potomi framework?
Yeah, that's lovely. And I think, and that was a lovely question at the time. And I think it's a really great question to give some examples about what we're trying to achieve here, Nicky. So the answer is yes, because for me, from my social cultural lens and from thinking about mental health nursing, everything is about that connection and relationship. That would be the way that I would frame it up. So a Potomi recording a mental state assessment and not thinking about, and that not having come from a place of relationship and connection probably isn't much use as a Potomi, because you're probably not getting a lot of honesty in the conversation. So for our students, particularly early part of the curriculum, their experience of that might be in observing another health professional, another nurse or a doctor or mental health specialist undertaking a mental health assessment, for example, and you might be kind of observing how that's happening. So that's probably a kind of a simpler example. But if you're in a position yourself to be talking with somebody and you're doing that from whanaunga, then the important skill that we want you to develop is to be able to kind of touch on all of those areas that we might talk about in a mental state assessment. If that comes from a framework that reflects the conversation with the person, if that comes in a way that because of a cultural connection or whatever that connection is, that is far, far, far more important than whether it fits in little boxes. I know that you talk about this, Nicky, when you're with the students, and I do too, that I'm not interested in things fitting in boxes. We're interested in the quality of the relationship.
That's exactly right. And I think it comes through a lot when I'm talking with students, when they're giving me examples of when they've had an interaction with a patient, and it's not what they necessarily hear, but it's actually what they see in body language from the patients that they are interacting with. And I think what the students have is a really it's a really good place to sit at the moment as the observer when a registered nurse is doing any type of assessment, whether it be mental health or general, because actually mental health comes into a general assessment anyway. So from a student's perspective, the observation that they are going to achieve is going to be amazing.
No, absolutely agree. And I had another question for you, Nicky, because the other day I went onto the TPO website, and TPO being the National Workforce Development Lead for Mental Health Addictions and Disability sector, and I did a little bit of revision that was really helpful for me. They've got an online little online kind of learning module working with Māori, essential kind of learning for everybody working in mental health, regardless of their role or organisation. And it was a useful refresher for me. And one of the things they talked about in this e-learning was how using te reo can be a really positive way about looking to build rapport when working with tangata whaiora or tangata whenua. And I wondered if you had, one of the scenarios it talked about was being mindful about use of te reo and assuming that the tangata whaiora you're talking to uses te reo in their everyday language. So could you share any thoughts about, because obviously I think we want to promote the use of te reo, but how we might do that if we're not sure if the person we're talking to speaks te reo themselves, and what some of the unintentional difficulties we could create by assuming that they do use te reo. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I guess being that I'm still on my own cultural journey, and I probably started my cultural journey full force probably about 6 years ago. And one of the things that I've had to overcome is the fact that I don't have te reo. I'm not a fluent speaker. But what I wanted to ensure was, just because you're not a fluent speaker doesn't mean that you can't use reo, and you can use it really safely. And so the one thing that I decided to do in my journey to realization of who I actually am and was and am, is that I started off with something really simple. So the thing that I introduced into my every single day is morena for the morning and kia ora for any other time.
Yep.
And what that does is, when you go to introduce yourself and you say, morena, I'm Nicky, I'm the nurse for today, or kia ora, I'm Nicky, I'm your nurse for today, is it actually gives it gives Māori the insight to go, oh, kia ora back, or morena. And so if you have that interaction, or you have that response back to you, then it's safe to say that you can continue to use those words, or the odd words that you know. And usually I really use those simple terms that are well used. You know, wharipaku, whari iti for toilet, mimi, if I'm asking output. So just those simple little things that are usually used every day, even when Māori have lost their reo. So it's usually little bits and pieces that they will still hold on to without having to go into a full kōrero. You know, I've had patients that have, you know, I've gone, morena, kia ora, I'm Nicky, I'm your nurse for today, and they've gone onto a full-on mihi. And I'm like, whoa, you know? And so I let them go, because that's really important for me to hear the beautiful reo, and I want to make sure that they know that I really appreciate it. And I'll go, oh, you know, oh, sorry, mātua, I'm out, and I'll actually admit that I don't have reo. But then I usually build on that rapport by saying, however, I'd love to learn. So what can you teach me today while I'm your nurse?
Lovely.
And so we kind of have that relationship. The one thing I guess that people need to be aware of is not assuming that every brown person, every Māori, and everyone that looks Māori speaks te reo, because we've been so urbanized and we've been so sparsely spread from maraes that, the language has been lost. It's been lost through a number of reasons, and colonization obviously being the reason, but
yes,
also a number of other reasons and it is making an insurgence back, which is fantastic. But we're talking, I'm talking my mum's generation, people that are in their 50s, 60s and 70s. Yep. They're the lost generation. They're the generation that don't necessarily speak te reo, but they may understand it. Just because they don't speak it doesn't mean they don't understand it. But it's such an assumption thinking, oh, you're an older Māori person, so you're bound to know te reo. And I think we can put this assumption onto our patients, and it's just untrue. So, and it makes them feel whakamā, it makes them feel awful about who they are, and almost, I'd hate to say it, not, like a plastic Māori, like they're not good enough because they don't have the reo. So, and it's taken that generation a lot to bring it back for us. We're the lucky ones. We're the ones where the insurgents are starting to come back and it's being normalised, and it's recognised as one of our official languages, which is great. Yeah.
Kia ora, Nicky, thank you. And I guess if I was to then, as I absorb what you're just sort of telling me, it's a reminder about the importance always in nursing about looking to build rapport it's an individualized response. Definitely not necessarily individual, because you might be working with whānau, but it's an individualized response regardless of culture. We'll be particularly mindful of it while working in partnership with Māori. And obviously I'm thinking about mental health and integrating mental health skills with cultural confidence and competence. Just as some sort of closing thoughts, just in a general level, Nicky, if you've got any advice for our students going out onto the placement areas and working alongside Māori, if I asked you, I'll put you on the spot here because we haven't prepped this, if I was to ask you to sort of think of like a top 2 or top 3 kind of ways to develop that cultural competence and confidence, what suggestions could you make for us, Nicky?
I think that one of the biggest or the most important thing, I reckon, is being your authentic self. So being confident in who you are and what your culture is, and being, I like to say, being inquisitive. So if I don't know someone's culture or I don't know the ethnicity, then I have no problem in asking. Even if it's if it is a Māori person who I've only just met and I haven't had to build that rapport, sometimes I'll say, what is your first language? And it's just something as simple as that, to work out how I can converse. It's, a lot of people, I think, are worried about offending and being non-PC. When actually, when you're inquisitive about someone's culture, it's showing that you're open to learning, and it's showing that you're open to their values and their beliefs, and not your own assumptions. And so I think that that's really important, that people remember that being inquisitive and asking someone about someone's culture or someone's ethnicity is not being rude. It is not being offensive if you're asking appropriate questions. And just having that ability to think that a person is a whole person, mind, body and soul. And I talk a lot about te whare tapa whā, and I talk about that because you cannot nurse a person without nursing their mental health, their physical health, their spiritual health, and their whānau's health. So no matter where you look at a person, it has a knock-on effect. When you are nursing one person, you are nursing the immediate whānau as well. Whether you want to or not, there is always, whether they're a mum, whether they're a dad, whether they're a niece or a nephew or an uncle, there is always somebody that looks up or takes that person's opinion as gospel or as really important. And so what you want to ensure when you're nursing someone is that you're doing it from, everyone calls it holistic nursing, but when I ask when a nurse says they could nurse holistically, I ask them, what does that mean to you? And when you think about, if you can articulate te whare tapa whā as holistic nursing, it covers mental health, it covers cultural competency and safety, it covers whānau aspects, it covers the physical body. So you are nursing holistically when you nurse with Te Whare Tapawhā and incorporating Hine Ngaro. And I know with your specialty, Graham, you know, mental health is such a specialist service, but we are all aspects of mental health nursing. We may not be specialised, but we certainly need to nurse the whole person. And that includes the mind.
Lovely. Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Nicky. I mean, I use the word, you use the word inquisitive, and I put the word in my language is curious. And I think it means the same thing. Well, kia ora, Nicky. Thank you so much for your time today.
No problem. Anytime.
Right. Talk to you soon.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora.